Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're looking at Game 16 from the 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Spassky. Fischer's had the upper hand. He has 9 points compared to Spassky's 6 points. So has a pretty good lead going into Game 16. This is the best of 24, so assuming that Bobby Fischer can hold on for even just a few more games, if he were to squeak out a win or two, it would be mathematically impossible for Spassky to come back. Bobby Fischer does have the white pieces, had a few games as draws lately, so looking to get back on the winning side. Spassky, knowing that he needs to make something happen, cannot go down another full point this late into the series. So we'll go ahead and get started from Bobby Fischer. Pawn to e4, one of his favorite openings. Pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, getting into the Ruy Lopez, and then pawn to a6. And Bobby Fischer decided to go with the exchange variation, one of his favorite variations in the Ruy Lopez. Pawn captures here on d6. Now, black could capture here if he wanted to with his b pawn or with his d pawn. Many players are going to be capturing with their d pawn. One of the few times that you will see a pawn capture away from the center of the board. Usually pawns are capturing towards the center of the board. This also opens up the opportunity for black to castle on the queen side and still have a very strong king defense. Bobby Fischer continues with castling on the king side. You're probably not going to see knight to e5, really a bad move here, because then queen could come down to d4, attacking both the pawn and the knight here. And you know, you could protect the knight with pawn to f4, but you could see how bad that's going to be. Queen could just come here to e4. Take that would be check. But you can see the knight come back here to f3. Queen takes on e4. Queen to e2. And then after the exchange, you see the king here on e2. Black just has a much better position in this board state. So we're not going to see white do that. Instead, we see castle on the king side. Now, there's a few ways, if you look at this from black's perspective, that they can continue. This pawn is under attack here on e5. So one of the options that black has is to play pawn to f6. And usually you don't see this because it weakens the king side, but as we talked about, black has the option to castle on the queen side, so he's not too worried about his pawn structure on the king side pushing up a little bit further. Another option that he has is bishop down here to g4. This pins down the knight, so it doesn't have to worry about the knight coming up here to e5, because then the queen could fall right here. This is usually followed by pawn to h3, and then the bishop could come back here to h5, or black could even play pawn to h5. And this is similar to, if you're not familiar with the fishing pole trap, one of my favorite traps in all of chess. If you haven't watched a video on it, you can go ahead and do that. I have created that for you to watch. This is a similar situation as the fishing pole, but it'll same premise. After the pawn were to take here, the pawn recaptures. This opens up for this rook to have a strong attack on the king side. As we talked about, black's not too worried about his king side protection here. He's going to be castling on the queen side more than likely. This threatens the knight, and the knight can't really defend himself. Let's say the knight comes down here to e1, queen down to h4, and this is going to be mate in just a matter of moves here. So it puts white in a difficult situation. So even after the pawn comes down here to h5, white is not just able to capture here, just not how he would like to see it. If we don't see the bishop come down here to g4, some of the other options that you could see, queen to d6, trying to hold on to this pawn, or you could even see bishop here to d6. All of these are good options as far as how black wants to continue and hold on to this pawn here on e5. But Spassky decided to go with the common line around this time, and that was pawn here to f6. Bobby Fischer plays pawn to d4, and black now has two options. He could bring his bishop down here to g4, or he could decide just to go ahead and take this material here on d4. He opts for bringing his bishop down, getting his light square bishop involved into the game, and now Bobby Fischer, he could take with his own pawn here on e5, exchange the queens on board, or could not worry about the center of the board and play pawns to h3. Now, sometimes if you play pawn to h3, white can get a little confused on how to actually counter the bishop taking here on f3. Because they look at this and say, okay, well, I have my queen defending this right here, but the queen is also defending the pawn here on d4. And so they end up doing something like pawn taking here on f3. They really weaken their king side of the board, but they don't want to give up this pawn in the center of the board. They can actually take here, so the queen can take here on f3. If we do see the pawn take on d4, then the rook can swing over to d1. This is threatening it. Let's say pawn to c5. Now queen to b3. This is threatening the square here on b7. Maybe rook to b8. But then pawn to c3 is really what solidifies it. You can see this pawn can't take right here. If something were to happen like pawn to d3, this is completely okay. You could just see pawn up here to c4. Now both the rook and the queen are attacking it, and now there's no way for black to defend this. So this is the way that white would be able to come back and get that pawn if he was worried about it. Now in the center of the board, that may not be the setup they were hoping for, but it still allows white to have that king side structure like he wants from his pawns. But in the game, Bobby Fischer decided to just go ahead and take with his pawn here on e5, not worry about all of the scenarios that I just went over. The queen comes down, takes on d1, rook takes on d1 after the pawn captures. The rook comes up here to d3, does not want to be pinned down by the bishop to the knight right here. So the knight's free to come up here and take on e5 if he wants to. Bishop to d6, getting that bishop involved into the game, also defending this pawn here on e5. Knight to d2, knight up here to f6, and then knight to c4. So both these knights are attacking this pawn in the center of the board. So black is going to go down in material, but decides to now come in here to e4, gobble up some material, and then knight to e5. I was a little bit interested to see, why Bobby Fischer took with this knight. This knight right here on f3 is under attack. I think it makes a lot more sense for him to go ahead and take right here on e5, so he doesn't have to worry about any pinning from this bishop here on g4, and since there's a lot more pawns to attack on the queen side of the board, having most of his material attacking that makes a lot more sense. But in the game, decided to go ahead and play knight takes on e5, bishop takes here on f3, rook or knight comes back here to f3, and then castle on the king side. Now before we said that black was probably going to castle on the queen side, and that's exactly what it looked like was going to happen. But now that most of the material's off the board, specifically the queens, black can be a little bit more aggressive. And he doesn't have to worry about kingside safety. He really can get his king involved in the center of the board if he wants to. But this is the quickest way to get his rooks connected and controlling the center of the board. So with the pawn off here, so semi-open file for this rook on the f file, can go ahead and attack. So definitely the most aggressive way that black can castle and still attacking his opponents. The bishop comes up here to e3. Pawn down here to b5, so both sides starting to push a little bit. Pawn to c4. Yes, giving up a pawn. Rook over here to b8. If you say, why wouldn't you just take that pawn? It looks like a free pawn. Well, it is and it isn't. Yes, you can take it right away, but white's going to be able to get that material back. Rook here to d4 immediately gets it back here. Can't really lose this knight here. As soon as the knight moves, then the pawn is just going to fall here on c4. In the game, after Bobby Fischer played pawn to c4, but Spassky decided to bring his rook over here to b8, supporting that pawn. Now Bobby Fischer plays rook to c1, supporting his pawn. The pawn takes. Bobby Fischer decides to go ahead and bring his rook up here to d4. He could have taken material, but he recognizes that he can get that material back later in the game. There's 3 pawns on the c file. There's no way for Spassky to hold on to all that material. So Bobby Fischer just trying to get his pieces in the position he wants them, not too worried about equalizing in the pawns right now. He can get that later on. Rook to e8, centralizing, also defending this knight so it doesn't have to move here. Knight back to d2 says, hey, if you want to go ahead and exchange our knights, we can. Also adding another attacker on this c4 square. Black says, yeah, I'll go ahead and take right here. Rook comes back here to d2. Now rook down to e4, defending the square here on c4. Pawn to g3, just wants to make sure that nothing's going to happen with this bishop coming down here. And then later on, if there was a back rank mate, just don't want to have to worry about it. So this does open up for the king to come to g2, which is a safe square since this bishop is a dark square bishop. Bishop down here to e5, and both the rook and the bishop now attacking this pawn here on b2. And since the pawn here on c4 is doing a good job of protecting the square here on b3, Bobby Fischer is forced to come up here to c2 to protect the square. King to f7, starting to get involved into the game. King to g2, rook takes on b2, king up here to f3, attacking the rook on e4, pawn down to c3, king takes, pawn takes here, and then the rook takes here on d2. So all of a sudden, black is up in material, but as we talked about before, too much material right here for black to hold on to. White's going to be able to gobble up some of that. Rook back to b5, rook to c2, attacking this pawn here on c6. Doesn't really matter where it moves to. You can see that if it comes to the dark square, both the bishop and the rook are eyeing down on that square, would be able to capture anyway, and the king can't come over fast enough to hold on to that material. So as soon as we see bishop to d6, now rook to c6, both sides are again equal in material. Rook to a5, and then we see bishop to f4, says, hey, if you want to exchange off material, that's fine with me. Rook to a4, check, king back here to f3, safe square. Same thing again, both sides just going back and forth. After we see the rook come down here to a2, then the bishop comes up here, exchanging. After the rook takes, we are again equal in material. Black does now have a pass pawn, so if anyone has an advantage, it is Buddy Spassky, but it is a very, very small one. It will be difficult for him to hold on to this advantage. Plays rook over here to f2, says, yeah, I'm not even going to worry about too much. I don't think I can take this to the end game. So takes a pawn over here on f2, and Bobby Fischer takes here on a6. Now for the next many moves, we see a lot of back and forth as both sides recognizing this is an end game that they are very familiar with, and it's very difficult for them to actually win. If they had pawns further up the board, it may be an opportunity where someone could actually do something. But seeing as how their pawns are only on the 3rd and the 7th rank respectively, and they're really going to have to move maneuvering their rook around the board for the most part. Both sides not going to be able to do too much, and so they're just moving back and forth, seeing if they can come up with anything. But at the end of the day, both sides realizing that there's just no way for either side to break through, seeing if their opponent will make a mistake in the endgame, but neither player does that in this particular game. So we go on a little bit longer, but after move 60 in the game, we do see both sides decide to go ahead and draw. They decided they've had twofold repetitions multiple times, and there was just no way to break through, and so they decided to go ahead and end it. I feel like Bobby Fischer's got to feel pretty good about this. Yes, you have the white pieces you would love, especially in the exchange variation, to get a win. You feel super comfortable in that opening. But after Game 16, still having 3 full points ahead of your opponent has to be a good feeling in a best of 23 series. So hopefully you guys enjoyed Game 16. Some high-level chess being played. Many people like to always see a victor in these games, but at the end of the day, you don't always get that. You just want to see exciting chess. So hopefully you enjoy this one, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.